Implementing ITIL, Learning Module Number 5, Designing IT Service Management Solutions. This module will cover the ITSM design work stage in our ITIL implementation life cycle. In this module, we will cover some of the key work steps that are in the ITSM design stage, and we'll also take a look at a 10-stage process that you can use for building your processes, your ITIL processes, one step at a time. By now you should be getting familiar with our ITIL implementation life cycle: the visioning, the assessment, the planning, initial wins, design, and transition. In Module 1, we ran through this implementation life cycle at a high level. We then, in Module 2, covered the vision work stage, the importance of the business vision, setting objectives, establishing an ITIL implementation program charter, how this is really an organizational change effort, identifying stakeholders, and getting key people on board with the effort. In Module Number 3, we covered assessments: how to assess your current processes, technologies, organization, and governance practices. In Module 4, we finished off the assessment effort by translating the outputs of the assessment to action items, gaps, and then eventually into our initial win projects. We also covered the planning stages of setting up your ITIL implementation program, and we also covered some basics around what an initial win is and the kinds of initial wins that you may institute for each of the ITIL version 3 processes that are out there. In Module 5 now, we're ready to hit the design stage. And in the design stage, we'll figure out how we're going to design the ITIL processes, take a look at some key concepts about processes in general, and then also cover this 10-stage approach for building your processes. This module will have 2 lessons. In Lesson 1, we'll cover some concepts around design, take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the steps that are involved with the ITSM design work stage. In Lesson 2, we'll take a look in detail at the 10-stage approach that you can use to designing and building an ITIL process. This approach can be used really for any ITIL process that you're going to be implementing. So let's proceed ahead. Lesson 1, ITSM Design, a Deeper Dive. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the ITSM design work stage in much more detail. For this particular lesson, we'll examine some basic concepts around building your process solutions. Let's take a look at the ITSM design work stage from a high-level perspective in terms of its key activities. Here is presented a high-level view of the design work stage from the overall ITIL implementation life cycle. The key activities in this work stage are driven from all the items that need to be part of your process solution. You may remember the process model that was briefly presented in the last learning module. Each part of each process item that's in that process model is really a step here in terms of how we're going to build our processes. The key outputs from this effort will be a process guide, or process guides if you're doing several processes, and a master transition plan for how we intend to transition those processes from their design state into being used on a daily basis by your IT staff. The processes of building the processes, if you pardon the pun, have basically boiled these tasks into a 10-step gate procedure for how you will build a process. We'll look at that in much more detail when we get into Lesson 2. But for now, the key tasks, as you can see them here, include managing this work stage, executing your communication strategy, defining mission goals, principles, inputs, outputs, policies, procedures, tools, if there's tools involved with this effort, roles and skills, your organization, building a process guide, defining your process reporting, and then building a transition strategy or plan for how things will move into production. So again, these are all the key pieces and parts of the process that you will be designing in this work stage. We've talked about initial wins, and we've also talked about process design. The initial win efforts will be done in parallel with the design efforts. Remember that the key difference is that the initial wins are focused on small, discrete projects that are very tactical in nature. Each one of these wins has a very well understood purpose and set of deliverables that might be associated with it. In short, an initial win takes a project focus in terms of your implementation efforts. The design efforts, which are done in tandem with the initial wins, are really more strategic in nature. They focus on the process solutions that will be put into place that will underpin your initial wins that you've identified. So again, think of initial wins as tactical things that get done that people can see and touch, and the design tasks are a little bit more strategic in terms of laying the foundation, if you will, for the processes that will underpin those strategic or those initial wins that you plan to implement. Looking a little more detail between the initial wins and the design work stage efforts. Again, the design stage is very strategic, and this is where we'll be designing the process, implementing things like policies, establishing process metrics, putting roles and responsibilities into place. So again, it's really a capability type of exercise that's happening as we start to work through that design stage. And then remember that in the initial win stage, a lot more of a tactical focus is taken. And you can see by some of the examples presented here. Implement a service catalog, establish a change advisory board or CAB, build a service capacity plan, implement an incident management tool. Those are all very tactical things that people can see and touch, and that's what creates our initial wins. Another way to look at this is by what's shown in the balloons below this. The design work stage, again, is very strategic, and it's going to identify steps that show how the work will be done. Whereas on the initial win side, much more tactical, and it will have steps that show what work will be done. Here's why we've split the initial wins out from the design and treating them a little bit separately. If only the design activities were done, in other words, all you're doing is spending your time building your process, putting your process resources into place, designing the process steps and how the process will work. The end result is that I may have a very strategic solution from a process perspective, but at the end of the day, the business still really hasn't seen anything positive necessarily from that effort. It may not be something that they can see or touch. How do they know that the process is in place? How do they know that the process is working? So in short, a focus totally on process design would probably have a high risk of ending up in nothing else but just being what some people might call shelfware. If I only focused on the initial win activities, those tactical items in terms of implementing specific things that people can see and touch, the end result of that would be that I may have a mess, if you will, of individual projects without any guidance or integration. Lots of little things that are going on, but it's very unclear how they tie together or how they work. So by combining both of these efforts together, initial wins and IT service management designs, I focus on producing things that people can see and touch and will see value in, but at the same time I'm doing that with a larger picture in mind in terms of strategically understanding and building those processes that will underpin everything going forward. Now let's take a look at the design effort itself. The effort starts with stakeholder teams and finishes with those agreed document process guides and transition plans. Remember that concept, core team, extended team, advisor team, in terms of how you may organize your implementation effort. Remember, it's the core team that focuses on shirt sleeves rolled up and getting the work actually done. The extended team, which will be representatives from different IT units and business units, and they will kind of act as your extended arms and legs in terms of providing the core team input to how they're going to build and design their processes, as well as shopping what's being produced with the units that they represent. The advisor team will be there guiding and helping to put resources and funding into place to keep the effort going. As part of the design stage, you'll be producing things like mission and goals, guiding principles, workflows, inputs, outputs. We'll talk a little bit more about these as we get into the details in Lesson 2. And then finally, all of that will be summated in outputs in terms of a process guide, one or more of those, and transition plans for getting that process into production. Note that the core team, extended team, and advisor team represent your process stakeholders. That is the people that will be impacted and working with your processes after they're put into production. Your mission, goals, guiding principles, workflows, etc. Those will all be developed through collaborative working sessions with the core team and the extended team members. And then the outputs will be your documented process guides and transition plan that become the final results from all those efforts. But it's through these collaborative working sessions that a lot of these various pieces and parts of your process will get developed. So let's cover a basic concept here. What is a process? If we look inside the EIDL books, the exact definition is simply a structured set of activities that provide value to a customer or stakeholder. An extended view of that might be that it's a sequence of repeatable activities that have measurable inputs, value-added activities, and measurable outputs. So again, a process can be almost anything that you want it to be. The one thing that all processes absolutely have to do is provide value to a customer or stakeholder that will be either working with it or using it. As a review, these are all the pieces and parts of your process that need to be in place in order to make sure that it's working. Again, these are taken from the EIDL books, specifically the EIDL process model. Notice that we've divided this by our work tracks: governance, process, technology, and organization. There are those 4 pillars, again, that are underpinning each of the solutions that we build. Under governance, we're looking at process items such as mission and scope, guiding principles, policies, controls, and our measurements such as KPIs or even critical success factors if you have those. Under the process piece, we're looking at all the typical things you'd expect to be in a process: workflows, work instructions, products such as forms, reports, inputs, and outputs. Technology, we might be looking at tools or any other supporting technologies that we will use to automate and enforce the process that we're implementing. And then from an organization perspective, we need to have an assigned process owner, roles and responsibilities for executing the process, making sure those roles and responsibilities are assigned to your IT organization, and then finally assigning real resources to fill those roles and make sure things are being executed. Again, remember, unless you build all the items that are shown in this slide, you essentially will not have a process. Here's a recommended way of looking at your processes in a structured manner. If you take any process, at the highest level, that process will have some set of activities that's associated with it. Each activity that's identified can be broken down at a lower level into procedures, which is kind of a logical flow, step by step, if you will, in terms of how that activity is carried out. Below the procedure level, I may have detailed work instructions. Work instructions will be the lowest level of detail, and typically they will provide a very discrete, step-by-step, here's how something is actually done. And we'll see some examples of these coming up here in just a bit. Now you may ask, where do I get the process activities from? Well, the processes themselves are simply right out of the EIDL books. Very good way to get started. And the activities, those are also from the EIDL books. So again, the EIDL books are very good at prescribing the activities and the high-level processes that need to be in place. So now let's go down one level. We have our high-level process, we have our activities, and again, those can come from the EIDL books themselves. This is a good starting point. And then for each of the EIDL activities that are described there, I may need to come up with a more detailed view of some of the procedures that underlie that. What is the workflow or the logical step-by-step progression for how some of those activities might be executed. What's interesting about the EIDL books is there's a little bit of a mixture when you look at each chapter on the different processes. Some of the processes provide you actual procedures that you can use as a starting point. A lot of what were the service support or now service operations processes tend to have a lot of that in there. For example, what's the procedure, if you will, for handling different incidents? What's the procedure, as service transition would show, for handling changes? And the books actually provide some fairly specific examples of procedures that underlie some of those process activities. Other chapters within the book may simply just specify the activities and not really give you the logical procedure flow with them. For those, if those are the processes you're working with, you may need to design the correct and appropriate process procedure that underlies each of the activities that you plan to use. Remember that each of these flows represents a drill down of an activity, and one way to look at this is where I have each segment in the flow, or in this example, which is kind of like a flowchart example, wherever I have a square box, that will be linked to a lower level work instruction, which we'll take a look at on the next slide here. So now let's take a look at a work instruction and what that might look like. Remember that work instructions are a very specific drill down of a process activity or procedure segment. So I can link these to each of the procedures or activities that I have with each process. Take a look at how specific this particular example is. In here, the procedure may be describing, or the activity says, we need to log an incident. So that becomes part of the overall, let's say this was an incident management process. So now I know I need to log an incident. But somebody who has to use this process might be asking, well, okay, how do I log an incident? So the purpose of the work instruction is to provide the answer to that question. And here you may see some very specific items, such as step 1 here. It says enter a user phone number. Actually, you may have a first step which says here's the URL to bring up the appropriate tool. Then I say I need to enter the phone number. I might have to hit this particular PF key. Then I'm going to enter request details. I'm then going to have to select an incident category, maybe from a drop-down menu, hit a save button, then determine the request priority if it ends up that it's really a request. So again, these work instructions are fairly detailed, and they typically describe how to use a tool or enter information on a form or some low-level type of description that needs provided, mostly so that people using your process and your procedure understand the exact steps they need to take in order to how to use it. So let's take a bit of a review here. At the highest level, we have our process, which is certainly documented in the EIDL books. We have process activities, and again, these can also come from the EIDL books. We then break those activities down into procedures, and again, some of the procedures may be in the EIDL books, others we may have to actually define and build, or maybe you already have some of these in your own organization. And then for the different boxes, if you will, in the procedure, or the different steps in the procedure, I may have to include work instructions that give people a very detailed script in terms of how they would execute that activity or procedure. If I kind of take an example of this again, let's take something under change management. We know that we have a process called change management. There may be an activity in change management called log the change. We then have a procedure that may show some high-level steps in terms of logging a change, and an example of that might be something like fill out the request for change form and then submit it to the change management group. And then I may have a work instruction that provides a URL to the change management tool, brings up the RFC form, and then gives you a step-by-step, here's how to fill out the RFC form, probably based on the kind of change that you're about to make. So again, that's just an example to give you a feel for how some of these processes flow right down to the most detailed levels. Again, a way to look at this is a process identifies at the upper levels what needs to be done, and then the procedures and eventually the work instructions will identify how it needs to be done in a stepwise fashion. So you need to make sure you build your processes first, and then fill in the detail in the form of procedures and work instructions following that. This gives you a very orderly approach for how you're going to build your future state process solutions. Now let's take a look at your IT environment. And the key challenge here is information is everywhere. If you take a look at your IT environment, chances are you have lots of process documentation, very low-level work instruction information, although maybe people don't call it work instructions, but they might be saying, I have this very detailed procedure. Maybe it shows how to put a server up, or maybe how to do some activity within IT. And this stuff is all over your IT department. It might be on some established repositories. It might be in people's drawers. It might be on pieces of paper. It might be sitting on their personal laptop maybe in a tool of some kind, or a database or spreadsheet. So all this stuff is out there. One of the steps you will do early on is pulling all this information together, looking at your current environment to bring all this documentation in, and then sort and sift through it to decide what's usable and what's not usable. For those items that are usable, you're now going to store that stuff into some repository of some form or other. And guess what? You're going to put that repository under the control of change management. Because if you've now decided to use a specific process or set of work instructions that somebody has in their drawer, you want to make sure that that doesn't get changed or altered unless the entire process implementation team now agrees that makes sense. So one of the implications of doing this is that as you collect existing documentation, you're going to start to be putting it under the control of change management to make sure you can do this. And for those of you thinking about configuration management, storing that information somewhere and pointing to it with records is an early form of some configuration management activity as well. So here's kind of a summary of integrating that field documentation. Again, remember, you're going to collect things where you can find them, identify each artifact you have, and find a place for it. If you pick up an artifact, make a determination: is this a process description, description of an activity, a procedure, or does it really belong as a low-level work instruction? Then once you've identified where that will fit in terms of the hierarchy, which process does that belong to? So if I have something that says, here's how to fill out an RFC form at a very low discrete level, then I'm going to classify that as belonging to the change management process. What kind of repository you use is up to you. I've seen some companies use things like SharePoint, for example, as a way to store these. But as you pull these together, it's really good if you can find a way to make sure they're actually linked together such that you can bring up things, let's say at the change management level, and then drill down to find all the lower level procedures or work instructions that are associated with that particular process. This is a good thing to put into place as you get started in your IT service management design stage. So here's an example of how everything fits together organizationally in terms of your implementation team for the design work stage. Again, notice that we have all of our tracks, if you will, represented here in terms of the technology and governance and process and organization that are in place. Technology is represented by the architecture team box in the lower right-hand side. You see a spot there for organization and a spot there for governance. Now again, this is used for a very large organization, global in scope. So I have a program office, I have a service manager kind of running with this. Process owners, we may have global process owners and local process owners. And here you see I've got local process coordinators, extended stakeholder teams, our core team, advisor team, and an architecture team which covers the technology. Again, this is for a very large organization. Smaller organizations, you may collapse much of this, and maybe one or two people may end up kind of covering most of the areas that are kind of shown here. Do notice, though, that we still use our core and advisor teams, and those are the groups, again, that are interfacing with the business units and other IT departments. Again, there's no prescribed way for how you should organize to implement, because this is very dependent on the scope of the processes you plan to implement, how your company is organized, and how large your company is. However, here's an example that maybe you can steal to start with and then just tailor this to what makes sense for your organization. Lesson 2, building the processes. In this lesson, we're going to review in a fair amount of detail the 10-step approach that you can use for building almost any ITIL process. A recommended approach for designing a process has been broken down into 10 stages of effort or subtasks. This has been done to help you mark your progress throughout the design and build effort. Each stage should be done as a workshop or focus session with key stakeholders to ensure buy-in to the solutions being considered. Remember, we do not want to approach this by trying these alone with your small isolated team and hope that these will somehow become implemented. Again, experience has shown that when you isolate yourself and try to design all the process stuff and then bring it out to other people to use, generally you have lots of resistance and problems there. As you go through these, and let's take a look at each of these steps here. We have a stage 1. You notice I'm using the term stage instead of step. But in stage 1, we're going to draft our process mission and goals. Stage 2, draft guiding principles. Stage 3, document our current state processes. We're going to go back and look at those in more detail, what we have today in our IT environment. Stage 4, we're going to review the IT service management best practices. Stage 5, we're going to draft a gap analysis. 6, agree the process foundation or design, if you will, all the design points. Stage 7, confirm the high-level process design with our stakeholders. Stage 8, confirm our gap analysis. Stage 9, publish the process guides. And then Stage 10, plan our process deployment. So this is a sequence of 10 steps that you can do in order to get a process started from almost having no process to getting one in place. One of the interesting things about this approach, and the reason we use the term stage here rather than step, is that it's recommended that you finish each stage before you go on to the next one. So for those of you that may work in a program office or your project managers and you need to communicate how far along is this effort in terms of building processes, you can communicate that back by each of the stages. And knowing that there's 10 stages to getting a process designed, the way you can communicate this back to management would be, for example, let's say we were working with 3 processes. Let's say it was incident, problem, and change. I can communicate back from a project management standpoint that currently in the incident management process design stage, we are at stage 4. In our change management process design stage, we are at stage 7. And at our problem management process design stage, we are at stage 2. So this is a way of highlighting and communicating to management how far along you are when you're working on process implementation. This is very well accepted in my experience when working with senior executives and others because they can actually see progress as the project is proceeding, as your efforts are going forward. Without doing something like this, typically all they know is that there's a group of people working on changing some process here or there, and they're not always sure what that group is working on or where they're at. This gives you a very clean way to publish the steps you're taking and how far along you are all the way along from the day 1 of your project until it's completed. Now let's take a look at each stage in more detail. So let's look at stage 1, draft process mission, goals, and success factors. In stage 1, the process mission, its goals and success factors are discussed and drafted. And again, you will be doing these through some kind of a workshop or focus session. The critical success factors identified earlier, remember we did these early on when we did the visioning stage, are re-examined and may be slightly modified or presented as needed. It is also at this stage that the KPIs, or key performance indicators, will be identified and documented. Think of KPIs as metrics that matter. Those are basically measurements that indicate how well you're proceeding along your critical success factor. Usually a KPI is something that indicates a decision that needs to be made to management, and it's expressed in terms of some kind of a value that tells people they need to take some action or that things are okay. The mission and goals can be taken from the ITIL books. You can also look at the implementing ITIL book that came with the course, and these are shown with each process chapter in that book, so you can kind of steal some of the mission statements that are presented there. The measuring ITIL book gives you a complete set of starter KPIs and CSFs if you need them as well. So again, you have some sources that you can go to pull these together. You don't necessarily have to start these from scratch. What you would do with your core team then is to go ahead and draft the mission, the goals, the CSFs, and the KPIs, and then schedule a workshop or focus session. You may have several of these depending on how many stakeholders you're working with your extended team and your advisors to present this, what you've come up with. Modify this based on feedback where it makes sense, and then finalize it to complete this stage. When the stakeholders agree with the mission, the goals, the CSS, and the KPIs, you've now completed stage 1 of getting your process started. Make sure when you start that you baseline your metrics. So after you've identified what your CSFs and KPIs are, produce that report that shows where you sit today from day 1, even though you haven't really implemented anything in terms of a process. So here's an example where KPIs have been documented. Notice that the baseline values have been identified, and those may come from existing reports or other information you have in your organization. And the key thing here is to remember, take these from whatever sources exist currently. Do not try to architect or build something in order to populate this sheet with a number. Either these measurements exist or they do not exist. If they do not exist, put a TBD, to be determined, in the column. And this really has some value to management. If you look at the example that's presented here, you see many TBDs. This basically tells management that we do not have the capability today to even measure ourselves to see how well we're doing. And that's an important piece of information that management needs to see and understand as you get started. During the transition work stage, as your process is being implemented and embedded into the organization, these TBDs will start to turn into real values. As you turn these into real values, this physically demonstrates progress that you are making on getting your process in place. It shows the process is now coming into shape. The purpose is also of this is to keep that momentum going, and this will get people excited not only in your team but also in your stakeholders. As they start to see these TBDs turn into some real numbers, it starts to show some real progress in terms of how your process is proceeding along and your capabilities to measure and monitor how well it's working. Also, experience has shown that management and stakeholders will continually question how your project is going, why are we doing this. Doesn't matter how much money they put into it, those questions always come up. When those questions come up and you've been tracking things in the way that we're showing here, you already have the answers for them at your fingertips. You don't need to stop what you're doing and start to measure things or justify the actions you're taking. Just simply give them the latest reports that you have as you're executing on these. Produce these reports on maybe a monthly basis, even as you're implementing the process. So even though the process is not in place, still produce these reports so you can show how things are progressing over time. And again, the value of this is when those questions come up from management about where the project's at or what's going on, you have these at your fingertips and you don't have to distract your team to try to scramble to produce this stuff on a last-minute basis. Now let's take a look at stage 2. In stage 2, we're going to identify and draft something called guiding principles for our process. A guiding principle is basically a general statement of belief, direction, and philosophy that will guide the key design decisions about your process. Principles come in 2 formats. They may be specific to the process, or they may be general in that they apply to all the processes. The principles from all the processes should be assembled by the service manager that's running the project, categorized and rationalized between all the process efforts to make sure that there's no duplication or overlap between principles that may exist in one process versus another. Now you may be asking, how do I get started on principles? The starter set is in your materials for each of the EIDL V3 processes that are out there. Those are documented in something called Process Design Guidelines, and there's a set of guidelines for each of the EIDL V3 service lifecycle stages. So if you look at the guideline materials, let's say for service design, you will see examples of principles, let's say for things like service level management or service catalog management or capacity management or availability management. So again, you have a starting place to go for getting started on each of these principles. Remember that overriding principles are those that apply across the board. Okay, an example of an overriding principle might be something like no services will be provided unless they exist in the service catalog and service portfolio. That might apply to all the processes in terms of what they're producing. Others may be very specific. For example, all incidents must be recorded in a single system. That might only apply to the incident management process. So here's an example of a guiding principle in more detail. This particular principle is an overriding principle as it applies to all the processes that are out there for V3. Notice that the principle has three parts: a principle, a statement, rationale, and implications. The principle here is defined as the statement. Under rationale, we give key reasons as to why that statement is important or chosen, or what its benefits may be. The implication section describes key impacts on IT or the business that will occur because the principle is in place. So if we look at this example, the principle statement says each systems management process will have a single process owner responsible for process quality and integrity. Now under rationale, we have to say, why do we care about that principle? What's the benefits or importance of that? Well, if we have a single process owner that's accountable for process quality and integrity, it keeps the process discrete and bounded. So the owner has a very specific area and it prevents finger pointing across the organization. It avoids responsibility conflict or uncertainty, who really owns a particular process or not. It promotes responsibility and continuous improvement because we're going to use this to assign improvement activities and responsibilities for improving processes to specific individuals with that specific ownership role. Now, what does this mean from an implication standpoint? And this is specific to how does this impact your particular company or IT organization. Number one, we need to ensure the process owner is at the right level in the organization. So right at the get-go, we're saying, let's start by making sure whoever is selected for this has the appropriate teeth and within their role and organization structure to get things done. The process owner will help define the process ownership role. So there's a task that may need to happen. The process owner resource must be assigned and dedicated. So this implies that we need to assign a person to this role. There may be other things that you have specific to your organization. It possibly means we need to hire additional resources, or maybe we need to shift responsibilities in order to make this happen. So again, your implications focus on what does this mean to your organization. The guiding principles will be used as key criteria for your process, tool, and organization decisions as you undergo design. So again, that's why we call these guiding principles. They'll kind of like overlay the design decisions that you may make when you have choices within your process design efforts. The guiding principle effort is also helpful for becoming the basis for your policies and your governance practices that take place. So as you get farther down the line to pull your policies and governance types of things together, the guiding principles will be a good starting point to capture some of that right away and give you a jump-off point for producing more around those areas. Now let's take a look at stage 3. In prior steps, we already did our assessment, we came up with some gaps, we did some recommendations, came up with some initial wins, and all of these reviewed by the process team. In stage 3, we're now going to compare that information against what's really out there from an EIDL good practice research and information that exists either in the books or other sources that we're able to get. What are the desires of our organization? What needs to work? What we're going to do in stage 3 here is actually review our current state in our IT organization in much more detail. Think of this as trying to understand where we are today from a much more detailed level. In the assessment, we were looking at some of this only to identify issues and problems that we need to fix. Here we're going to try to make sure that we fully understand how we're operating today. If some of this information exists, and things like if you have workflows, inputs, outputs, descriptions of roles, tool requirements that already exist, that's goodness in terms of getting a fast start. Otherwise, if we don't have this stuff documented, we're going to have to go through our organization, probably do this in a workshop setting with your extended team members and your subject matter experts, and identify and understand what is it that people do today. Again, we need to include people and understand where everybody's operating today so that as we start to change some of those behaviors, we want to make sure that we fully understand what they're wrestling with today in order to make sure we get acceptance and hopefully little or no resistance as we keep moving forward. This is also the step, stage 3, where you'll gather up your process documentation in your organization. Remember that slide that said information is everywhere? Here's the stage where we're going to try to grab all that information, put it in the appropriate hierarchy, store it in our repository for those things that we plan to use, and put it under the control of change management. That would be another key step as you go through this stage 3 process. Here are examples of process roles for the problem management process. And this, again, we're just presenting this here as one example of a process and what you might be pulling together for stage 3. We'll want to identify what kinds of roles are typical for problem management and then compare these to what's in place today. So again, the RACI chart, which we saw in Learning Module number 3, can be a good way of capturing and charting some of this information. So here I've got the role examples: problem management process owner, problem manager, problem owner, subject matter expert. You may have job titles that map to these very easily, or else you may have job titles that are all over the place. And what you'll need to do is understand what people do in your organization and try to map people or their job titles into where they may or may not fit with some of these roles. So this list of roles is a list of roles that is going to be needed to operate your future state process. And what you're doing here is trying to figure out organizationally today, do you have a very easy mapping into that set of roles, or will this be totally foreign to the way your organization operates today? Either way, you want to identify what the level of that gap is and see how that fits. If you're looking for examples of roles for each of the ITIL processes, again, the Implementing ITIL book will have examples of that. And if you want a lot of detail around roles and role descriptions, the Architecting ITIL book will present that in a lot of detail and give you a very robust starter set of roles for every ITIL v3 process that's there. So here's some examples of process inputs and outputs and how we might describe that. We're using an approach here called SIPOC, or Supplier, Input, Process, Output, and Customer. By the way, those of you that are familiar with Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma may see this as something very familiar. But this is an approach that you can use for documenting your current state process. This is one way to get it documented in a manner that can be referenced later as you want to go about designing your future state solution. So here you simply list the supplier, where do the inputs come from, what are those inputs, what are some of the key processes or steps that are taken, and then the outputs that are being produced, and who gets those outputs. That's your customer. So again, you're doing this in stage 3 in terms of what are you doing today within your existing organization. The Implementing ITIL book has an example of a SIPOC for many of the ITIL processes, and again, your download materials can also help if you're looking for examples. But when producing this, I would stay very much to what is your organization doing today. You're just using the ITIL process areas to kind of categorize these, just to organize those so it's easier to start designing your future state. Here's yet another approach for how you might describe your processes. This one's called LOVEM. LOVEM charts are a good way of capturing the people, process, and technology all in one integrated view. In this example, you can map process activities against the roles that are responsible for them and the technologies that are being used. So notice in this example, we have a flow chart like in the middle of the chart that kind of describes the procedure level, if you will, for how a process works. Off to the left-hand side, we've got a listing of all the roles, and then we've elevated the boxes, if you will, of that procedure into what role executes that particular step or boxes, or what's the primary role that executes that step or boxes. Sometimes if multiple roles are involved, you may put that box and extend it across the line, if you will, to both roles to show that. At the very bottom, we've got arrows that point to various outputs that may be output from each of these procedure flow steps that are shown here. So one of the advantages of using this kind of an approach for documenting your process, LOVE-M as it's called, is simply the fact that you can get that people, process, and technology and kind of get that all on one integrated view on a page. So here is even yet another example using what's a typical process flow or flow chart. Note that in this approach, the tools and responsibilities have also been combined with some kind of color code indicators. This is kind of like a flow chart on steroids, a little bit more than what you see in a typical flow chart. If I just have a typical flow chart, I get the flow of the activities that need to be done in the workflows, but I don't necessarily understand who's executing those workflows or what are the tools involved that may be used with each step that's going along the way. This is just a clever example of a way that you can integrate the tools and responsibilities using those little bubbles and the colors to kind of indicate that with each step that's there. Here's yet another example using something called IDEF0 for describing a process flow. IDEF is a form of modeling, if you will, for processes. There are a number of automated process design tools already in the market that use IDEF. You need to understand a little bit about the IDEF notation. It has very specific notation in terms of what the arrows and the boxes and the various lines mean. But the tools that use these tend to automate a lot of the use of that. This basically can help you build your process and make the modifications to the process more easier. In other words, I can edit these boxes, I can move them around, change the inputs and outputs, and the tools will help automate the drawings so that I don't have to redraw drawings every time something changes. There's a growing trend in business systems management technology to expand on this to actually control the processes and create control workflows once processes have been built. You're actually seeing some vendors producing tools now that are tying things like this into their tool sets, such that as you're executing the tool, you're forced to use the process that as it's been designed in these flows. Again, this is just another example of how you may describe processes that exist in your environment today. Here's even another example for how you might describe a process flow. This one's called scripting. In here, the steps are listed like lines of a script. Process roles are described as actors who execute the script. I've seen some more radical forms of these where they actually document this like a script where the actor appears first, followed by the steps. It literally looks like a movie script in terms of the actor's role or name being off to the left and the steps they execute on the right-hand side of that. But in this spreadsheet type example, you can see that I have my process steps are in each row and described in that very first column where it says steps. And then where you see actor 1, actor 2, actor 3, and actor 4, those are really roles. And the example here was a change management example being used. But what I've done here is just simply put an X where a particular role works with a particular step. That's one way to use this. Another way, and you may be ahead of me already on this, is if you use the RACI approach. Remember RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. And what you could do is replace the X with that RACI, and there's nothing wrong with doing that as well. That actually gives you a little more information than you would have with the approach that's described here. But again, a scripting approach is yet another way that you can use to help describe the processes or what's going on in your organization. Even yet another way of describing processes and steps is something called information mapping. Information mapping was a technique for documenting processes first invented by Robert E. Horne in the early 1980s. What's interesting about Robert is he foresaw inventions like the web and email and knew right away that there needed to be a shorthand for written communications to get directly to the point and provide the reader with only what they need to see and with lots of white space so that they can easily find things and absorb the information. If you type information mapping on the web, you will find a lot of vendors that are offering training and services around this. What's fascinating about this is the ability to take complex policy documents or process documents that may exist and translate these to much more simpler, easier to read types of documents using some of the techniques that are in information mapping. The interesting thing about this and the use of this, especially as you're looking at your current state processes, might be where you run across a situation where somebody has a documented process, but maybe it's sitting in a binder and maybe it's 60 pages of long text and it's very hard to read and understand. And you may decide to remap that using information mapping so that it's much more clear and legible so that you clearly understand all of what those procedures may be at this point in time. Again, an interesting approach, and if you have time, I would say it's certainly worth looking up on the web to find more information about this. Here we see our tools heat map, and we've already seen this before when we discussed the IT Service Management Architecture Analysis tool and we did our tools assessment in the earlier learning modules. And this current tool set, remember, is listed to the left, and each column is associated with each idle process or function. And within each row or column, we indicate whether a supporting tool is present and whether it's currently providing any value. We hopefully have already gone through this exercise when we did our assessment. But here we can go back to reference this to see what tooling improvements might need to be made and how well each process is supported by the tools in our current state. So again, at this point, if you've already done this, you've done most of the work for creating your gap analysis, if you will, when it relates to your tools. And here we'll just be reviewing the output again of that to understand what kinds of tools we may need to have in order to support the process that we'd like to see. And here we'd be looking at possible things when we look at what needs to be changed about tools in terms of, do we need to purchase tools? Do we need to replace tools? Maybe we can leverage the tools we already have. Those are some of the key decisions we may start to make as we start to look at this. Likewise, we already did a RACI chart for documenting the organization, hopefully when we did this in our organization assessment step as we discussed in our earlier learning modules. Again, remember that the RACI chart can be used as a way to understand current roles and responsibilities within the organization. We already use this to assess the current state, and similar to the tools analysis that we saw on the previous slide, we're going to look at the results of the responsibilities and roles to figure out, do we have to institute new responsibilities? Do we have roles that are missing that we need to create? And try to understand more of what's needed there. In association with this, you may also want to look at your company's skill set and decide for each role that's described here, where do we stack up in terms of our skill sets and capabilities? Is training going to be needed in order for people to come up to speed so that they can handle each role that's there? At this point in the effort, the process team should have a good handle on the current state of the process being improved, its issues and challenges. In this stage, our attention now turns to the kinds of improvements that will be made to the process. Improvements can consist of process modifications, wholesale redesign, tooling requirements to the architecture team, organizational changes to the organizational team, or other items. On this particular slide, these are a good example of the kinds of things that you may be redesigning. Could be process workflows, inputs and outputs, roles, skills descriptions, desired tooling descriptions, role organization mapping, roles and responsibilities, maybe desired data repositories that you need to put into place, or maybe desired reports or report templates that need to be built. But it is in this stage where you're going to take the output of stage 3, where you took a look at what your capabilities were currently in detail, compared that to the gaps that are there, and then started to make decisions around what types of things will be fixed, modified, or improved to meet your targets. One approach to do this is to utilize something called lens analysis. These are different ways to look at your current state process to identify where improvements may be made. Different kinds of lens are listed here: frustration, labor, speed and time, cost, etc. You re-examine your process, taking a different lens view to identify areas to be modified or redesigned. For example, you may look at your current process, let's say it's change management, with the variation lens. Using the variation lens, you'd be looking to see if there's a change management process that is being executed consistently across the organization. Or maybe you end up having multiple change management processes that are being done in many different ways by many different organizations. The variation lens basically would be used to look at a process from that point of view and determine whether this variation is good, whether it's needed, or maybe everybody should be working off a single similar process. Another example might be the labor lens. Here you're putting on a different set of glasses, if you will, to look at your process. Do people spend lots of effort executing the process? Are there redundant tasks executed over and over? Are there candidates for automation that would make that process run with less labor? Again, you can use this approach as a guide for drafting what improvements you plan to make. It doesn't hurt to look at each process that you plan to be working with and look at it with all the lens to see what value might be extracted out of the improvement efforts that you plan to make. As just another illustration of this, here we have our old way, if you will. In other words, here's a flowchart of how maybe our change management process used to work. And we're going to run that through the lens analysis, looking at that process in terms of, is it frustrating to use? Does it potentially use a lot of labor that it doesn't need to? Does it respond on a timely basis? Does it cost too much to execute? Are there confusion over roles and responsibilities? Or maybe I've got multiple change processes that are all working in different ways, or maybe just the output of the process in general is just not working. And I'm going to run the old way of doing things through those lenses and come out with a new way of doing things that hopefully addresses those areas that cause pain points, are inefficient, and meet the goals and targets that we initially set out in our vision stage. Let's turn to tooling. What do we do over there? Here we're going to be developing a base tooling strategy. Generic tooling requirements are listed on the left-hand side in this example. And again, the generic tooling requirements would really be the functional requirements that go with the function analysis that we did when we originally did our tool assessment. Again, if you're looking for detail on generic tool functional requirements, the Architecting Idle book provides more than enough to get you started in terms of all the different tool types by each process and what the general functions are that you may want to have in those tools. The right-hand side shows a high-level decision on how the left-hand side requirements will be addressed. Again, suggested generic tooling requirements for each process are in the Architecting Idle book. But here in this example, you can see that for each capability, we've identified under current strategy the kinds of tools that we may decide to use to meet the needs of that generic requirement. As you look at existing tools, decisions will have to be made. Should you use the tool that's already in place? Will that be good enough? Will you have to use the tool you have but make enhancements to that? Should you replace that tool? Should you maybe consider other options such as software as service or cloud computing to provide the same function? Should that whole function be sourced somewhere else? Those are the kinds of decisions that you will make at a strategic level during this stage and come up with a picture and a landscape in terms of what your tooling situation should look like as you look at your future state targets. Again, the Implementing IDLE book provides a lot of resources and reference that you can use as you go through this design stage. The means to build and design improvements to your process are many, and these will vary based on your current state and business need. Here's a list of some of the references in the course material that you can visit to get some ideas. Again, these can serve as starting points that you can elaborate on as you build your process. So for example, if you're looking for what are the typical outputs of processes, Chapter 13 in the Implementing IDLE book may be of help there. Tooling requirements you'll find in Chapter 14. Descriptions of process roles, Chapter 16. Ideas for principles, Chapter 17. Metrics would be the Measuring IDLE book. If you want details around tools and tooling functions, the Architecting IDLE book will be able to provide that. And if you're looking to get a head start on what are your IT services, maybe come up with some initial service descriptions for most of the common IT services, the Servicing IDLE book was a great reference point to start with to identify those. By the end of Stage 4, you will have designed your process future state in some kind of a draft form. Here in Stage 5, I'm now going to confirm the gaps and actions that are needed between your process as you envisioned it from Stage 4 and how it currently operates from Stage 3. This is where the metal hits the road, if you will, in terms of working with your stakeholders and reviewing the initial drafts of what you've come up with for a future state. The outputs of this stage will form an inventory of actions needed to get from the current to future state. Do your stakeholders agree with the general approach, the strategies, the decisions, the kinds of operational practices and behaviors that you plan to implement going forward? Once we've met with the stakeholders, we now proceed to Stage 6, which is agreeing the process design itself. Here you're going to be confirming agreement to the mission, the goals, the success factors, and principles defined earlier. In reality, you probably have at least somewhat of a general agreement as these were developed in earlier stages with your advisors to start with. Here you're laying out the process in detail, and you're basically reviewing these with your key stakeholders in terms of agreement and whether these approaches make sense. At the end of this stage, these types of decisions that you've already made for your future state process design will be frozen for the remainder of the implementation effort, only to change if testing or other factors prove that these will not work for one reason or another. In Stage 7 here, we're going to confirm agreement on our future state for our process. This includes all the workflows, the inputs, the outputs, role descriptions, tooling strategies, and reporting templates. Note that this agreement is not just with the design team and stakeholders. Other process owners should also be in agreement to make sure that what you have designed for a particular process does not conflict or overlap with other work that the other process owners may be doing at the same time. It is in this stage, Stage 7, where we essentially will be testing our process to make sure that it actually can work and be used by the business and others within your IT organization. It is in this stage that our testing of our future state process occurs. This can be done via something called use cases and walkthroughs. Again, these can be done in a workshop or focus session with your extended team and with representatives and advisors from different units. With this approach, use cases are first developed for your process. Use cases consist of scenarios that may occur as your process executes. Using change management as an example, examples of use cases might be an emergency change situation, a normal change situation, an unrecognized change that has just been discovered, or some other situation that relates to the change management process. In other words, you need to think through what are all the kinds of situations that your process may be used in or need. What events could occur that your process will get called into play, and foresee these in advance. Create an inventory of these kinds of situations. Once you've identified this inventory, you can then hold a working workshop or focus session and conduct a walkthrough of the process with selected groups of key stakeholders. When you hold this kind of a meeting, each stakeholder will play a process role. So take your process roles and assign them to the different people sitting around the table. A use case is then initiated, and then each player acts in that particular role that they've been assigned to as the process executes. This is being done as kind of a walkthrough or talk-through, if you will, to go through that use case. As you go through this, note whether key issues are raised. Are there any missing steps? Is there disagreement over how something should be done? Are people concerned that there's things that may not work within their own organization? In addition, as part of this meeting, these stakeholders may also bring up other use cases that you may not have thought about the first time around. This is an excellent way of doing some initial early process testing, and it really has two goals. One, it improves your process solution as you're able to test it and fix those areas that appear to not be working or that people are uncomfortable with. And even more importantly, you just started to create buy-in and acceptance by all the stakeholders that happen to be working with you running through these use cases. Now that we've tested our process, in Stage 8, we are now going to get to the agreement to the actions identified for getting to our future state process that were developed. So we're going to agree whether the actions we plan to take are correct. We're going to agree whether the design we have put into place has been correct, and whether any tools, data, anything else that relates to our process solutions, whether people are comfortable with that going forward. So it is in this stage, Stage 8, that the final agreement basically is taken with our stakeholders in terms of the process solution that's being developed. In Stage 9, we have all the content needed now to develop our process guide. The process guide will serve as a defining document for how this process will operate, the roles needed to execute it, any tools that you're using to automate it, and the metrics and reporting to measure it. All of the deliverables, if you will, that were created up to this point in the design stage should now be assembled and published as a single unit called a process guide. In our last step, others will review the process guide, again to make sure there's agreement with the items that are in there. And then in Stage 10, we're going to be assembling the transition actions that we developed and agreed in the prior stage and putting these into a detailed work plan. The development of this plan should happen in two passes. The first pass is taken directly from the transition actions that we identified as we went through the various design stages up to this point. The second pass should then integrate these into an overall master transition plan using the individual plans from each process owner, the architecture, organization, and governance teams. So as we look at transition, the kinds of elements that go into that transition plan would be those as shown on this slide. There may need to be a training and communication strategy executed as we start to roll this process out. A tool strategy may need to be acted on in terms of installing a tool, deploying a tool, putting tools into place. Resource and sourcing strategies will need to be executed on in terms of assigning people roles to execute the process, bringing in other contractors if that was desired in terms of helping or assisting with that process, or other types of resource and sourcing needs. We will need to do a procurement strategy. How will you work with the procurement department potentially to procure any kind of resources or tools or third-party vendor services that may be used with your process solution as it goes forward? And then lastly, a solution deployment strategy. How will your solution be rolled out and put into production? We will talk about many of these items when we get into the learning module number 7, our last one, in terms of transition. How do we transition our processes into a production state? But for now, within the design step, we need to at least design what we believe those solutions will look like and get a plan on the table that we can execute going forward. Let's now take a checkpoint as to where we are in our ITIL implementation lifecycle. We have now covered 4 of the 6 work stages: ITSM visioning, ITSM assessment, ITSM planning, ITSM initial wins, and most of the ITSM design work stage at this point. Remember that our initial wins are tactical improvement efforts. The ITSM design work stage represents more strategic improvement efforts. More importantly, that's where the process design occurs. When we move into Module 6, we're going to finish this ITSM design work stage mostly by presenting some real-life working issues taken from many different clients, from many of the different ITIL processes, and present what are the kinds of challenges that those people faced, and what are some of the techniques that were used to overcome that. So Module 6 will be an interesting module in that we will cover real-life types of issues as you start your implementation. The purpose being so that you start to see what you're going to be in for as you start to move forward, especially as you get towards that last transition stage.